What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, I'd like to go over HTML, CSS, as well as a little bit of JavaScript. At least enough of these three technologies in order to actually understand a little bit about how the DOM actually works. I'd also like to go through the window object as well as the document object and how they relate to these three technologies as well as the DOM itself. Let's just get right to the video. Okay, so to start, I'd like to kind of just set up some definitions for us. Now, before we go too deep into this, I want to mention again that we're not actually going to go through like learning HTML and learning CSS. In fact, if you haven't even really studied these too much before, it's really not a problem or too much of a prereq for this series. We're actually going to be learning this through the context of the DOM anyways, and we're actually going to eventually be able to write HTML and even CSS without actually really writing HTML and CSS, if that makes any sense. Right now, at least probably seems very confusing. It's like, what are you talking about, Nader? But you'll kind of see. And this is actually a precursor to other technologies like React, where you definitely don't really write any HTML or CSS directly most of the time. So let's take a look at what these actually mean to start. So HTML. What is HTML? Well, definitionally, it's kind of like hypertext markup language, right? But it's like, okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you very much. What does that actually mean? So really, HTML is the meaning and structure of a web page. Okay, so I picked these words kind of carefully and because they really mean something important, right? The meaning kind of means the semantics of a web page, which is a fancy way of just saying by looking at the HTML, you should kind of be able to understand what the intent is behind different parts of a web page. The structure is just that. It's kind of literally the structure of a web page, what is part of what, and where are they laid out on the page, generally speaking, at least relative to each other. CSS, however, cascading style sheets, if you want to be fancy, is all about the appearance and presentation of a web page. Okay, so it doesn't have anything to do with the structure generally. We can move things around with the CSS, but really HTML is all about the structure and the meaning, semantics. CSS is about generally the styling, the appearance, how beautiful things are, what they look like. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into these just so it makes a bit more sense. So to start, this is HTML. Okay, so we'll actually code this together in a second and take a look at it. But over here on the left-hand side, I have a bunch of HTML kind of code. Okay, it's really a template language. I wouldn't really consider it a programming language per se, because it's more of just kind of explaining what we want more than any logic involved, which we'll see shortly. So over here, we can see that we have HTML. Inside of the HTML, we have this thing called a head. We have a title. We have a body. Inside the body, we have these other things like an H1 and a div and a P, whatever those things are, right? If you've done HTML before, this is all probably pretty boring and pretty intuitive. But most importantly, I do want to point out that there's sections to this. Okay, there's kind of this head section. Okay, so and it has some structure to it and some meaning to what it means to be inside the head, right? And then same with the body, right? There's some structure and there's some meaning to be inside the body, right? Also, I do want to point out that I have this arrow here pointing down. This is really to signify that when the browser gets HTML, which we'll kind of get more and more intuition for as we build out more of these tools, it really reads it from top down, just like JavaScript code. Okay, it's read from the top, one line at a time, right to the bottom of the file. Okay, now this seems kind of pedantic, and it's like, okay, great. Why do I really care? You know, if it's bottom up or side to side or top down? And we'll see where this does impact kind of some decisions that we'll need to make later on. So just keep that at the back of your mind. Okay, so over here, if we were to kind of feed the browser this HTML code, it would what's called parse it or read it and try to understand the meaning and the intent behind it. And it would spit back out a web page that looks kind of like this, right? We'd have a title, we'd have our welcome kind of header one over here, whatever that is, and then we have our little meow text for our paragraph. Okay, so this HTML template gets parsed by the browser into the actual visuals that we see dictated by the structure and meaning of that code to actually show us visually a web page. Okay, now there's no styling here in this case. This is just purely basic vanilla HTML elements. So let's just code this out together and kind of get an understanding and feel for how this works. So I'm going to open up VS Code. I'm going to make a new file real quick, and I'm just going to call this html.js. just, oh my gosh, I got too excited here. I'm so used to making JS files from my previous HTML.html. This is going to sound really weird, but we're going to make an HTML file and we're going to have the extension be HTML. Okay, you can really call it whatever you want. Most people will call it index, but I'm just going to go with HTML just to be a bit different here. Now, at the top of the HTML files, what I didn't show is generally we want to have what's called a doc type. We'll get a little bit more in detail into this later, but the way that this works is kind of just like this. My VS Code actually auto-completes this for me because it's so common to type, but it's really a exclamation or a bang, and then doc type in all caps and HTML in lowercase, surrounded by these angle brackets, okay? Now, you don't really have to have this, but it's definitely recommended because of a lot of kind of internal details of how the browser reads non-HTML files and other types of files. It actually puts it into what's called a quirky mode if we don't have this, and some weird things can happen, hence the quirkiness if we don't have this tag at the top. So that said, let's kind of just put our HTML in here. Inside of here, I'm not going to spend too much time kind of going through what these different parts are because we're going to get a feel for this the more that we do this together. I don't want to bore you. So inside of the head, this is generally where we have like kind of metadata and some of our scripts and styling if we have that, as well as things like the title. So in here, I'll just put I'll put a title and I'll just put hi, just like I had there in the example. And then below the head, notice that the HTML has some closing tags here, which is what the slash is, same with the head. Below here, I'm going to put a body. And that's going to have its own closing tag as well. Not every element, which is what these are, or node, is going to have a closing tag, and we'll kind of get more used to which ones do and which ones don't over time. But it doesn't really matter too much for now. In here, I'm just going to put welcome, and then in here, I'm going to put a div. And a div is just a kind of a section that we can kind of nest code inside. And in here, I'm going to put a p tag, and I'm going to put my meow, and I think I had a cat. Let's see if I can find where's my cat. There it is. Smiley cat. Perfect. Okay. And that emoji keyboard, it should be command option space, command control space, something like that on a Mac. I remapped my keys. I don't actually know. And on a Windows, it should be control alt period, control shift period. Google knows the answer to all these questions. I would just refer to Google, to be honest. But anyways, once you have that working, you should have something that looks like this, right? And if you followed our previous guide where we installed Prettier as well and set it up to format on save, you should have everything kind of nicely formatted as you go. So if it's annoying you with kind of the spacing on things, definitely check that out. So you have a kind of a better time coding out this HTML and it's a little bit less tedious. Okay, so to open this, as usual, what we generally will do is open this in our Finder. So you can always right-click this and kind of do a reveal in Finder kind of thing, and it will show up like this. Or you can just kind of open up your Finder or Explorer or whatever operating system you're using and find the file and actually open it up by double-clicking on it. And so open it up in your default web browser. So in this case, I've done that, and you can see that I am showing this on my web browser here, where I see my H1, which is my welcome, and then my little meow, which is my paragraph. So I'm super zoomed in here. It's going to definitely be smaller on your own screen if you do this. Perfect. So that's HTML, right? This is the structure. And why it is a structure is because, let's say I take this H1 and I move it down here, right? If I move it down below the div and I come back to my Chrome here and I reload the page by doing a Command R or Control R, you can also click this reload button up here. You'll see that the structure changes, okay? Now, I want to show you something, right? Like there's a lot of these HTML tags. So I'm going to go to Google real quick and I'm just going to do HTML tags, or elements is technically what we want to be searching for. And if we scroll down a little bit, it probably should have searched for elements. We want to look at this one, which is my favorite documentation, Mozilla's MDN elements reference in this case for hypertext markup language. That's quite a mouthful. If I open that up, what we'll see is a nice long list. And I would invite you to kind of read this at your own pace. And you don't even really have to read through it because it's more like a dictionary than it is anything else. But you can see that there's a HTML element, which is the main root. There's all this other stuff in here that we can use. There's a body. And then there's all this content sectioning stuff. And this is the part that's about the meaning or the semantics. Some of these things are relatively new to HTML because they help indicate kind of the meaning behind something instead of just using what we used to do, which is have divs everywhere and paragraphs doing weird things. Now we can have a little bit more semantics to those, even though really they're technically just paragraphs or divs. Now we can kind of give the browser a bit more indication that, maybe this thing is like an address or maybe it's an article. And then it can do different things depending on whether it is an article, for example. Maybe it'll show like a different type of menu or something depending on what kind of operating system you're using. Okay, it's also really helpful for screen readers and people with visual impairment trying to navigate through this with technologies like a screen reader because it actually will treat these different tags very differently, which is a very awesome accessibility feature of these new semantic tags in HTML. So definitely try to use them as you go, but I'll let you read through all these. You can see that we use an H1 in here. There's a bunch of text-based ones. There's way too many for me to go through here. Quite frankly, this is more of a reference. Use these as you need them kind of thing. It's not worth sitting here and memorizing this. Totally not worth it. Treat this kind of like Google. If you want to do something where you're like, oh, I wonder, I don't know, like let's look at some of these. Some of these look kind of random. I wonder how to, put something in line. Maybe I'll use a span thing, or I wonder how to do a superscript or a subscript, right? Maybe I can use this super tag. And then you kind of learn them as you go. Not worth memorizing. I really have to hammer that home. HTML, I wouldn't treat it like you would treat like a programming language, like JavaScript or something. Maybe just treat it kind of like I want to semantically do this thing and have these features and be it laid out in this way. How do I do that? And what tags do I need to make it both accessible and easy to read for both developers and people who need it for accessibility purposes? So definitely take a look at this as you need it. It's definitely there and a good resource as usual. So we'll come back to our code. So this is kind of the structure, right? So we can move things around. We can add more stuff in here. And that dictates the structure of the page, and that's HTML. So let's head back to our slides here. So we basically coded this part. Okay. Let's take a look at CSS next. So CSS is the appearance and presentation of a web page, right? The beautification, the styling, the prettiness of the web page. It is also kind of a language, right? I would hesitate calling it that. It's more like a templating, I guess not really a template, but I don't really know exactly how to describe it. It's mainly telling the browser how to make things look, right? And it's relatively intuitive to understand, especially easy for humans to read for the most part. So if we look at something like this is a very basic example, but it's sort of saying, I want all my H1 tags to be red, right? Which is why this would be red. I'll show you this in a second. I want all my P tags, which are the paragraphs, to have a background color of pink and some border color that's blue here, which would do this. And I want the HTML background color for the entire HTML for the whole document to be green. And that would make this whole thing green, right? So let's take a look at how we do that. So up here in the head is generally where you would do this, or you'd create a separate file for this. But I'm going to do it in the head. We're going to add a style tag. Okay, make sure this is before the body in this case because of the order of the kind of reading this code. And we're going to put, for example, in here, H1, and then we put some curly brackets. I'm going to say, what did I say? I want this to be color. We're going to go American spelling here. We'll do red. And then I wanted to do my P tags, and then I want this to background color of pink. Okay, American spelling again, and a border. I'm going to say 3 pixel solid blue. And then after P is my HTML. Usually you put this at the top, but I'm going to say background color is green. That's going to be extremely beautiful. Let's take a look at this. So I'm going to save this file. Don't forget to save it, right? And then head back to our browser. And I'm going to go back to my tab here. I'm going to reload the page again, Command R, Control R, or just click the reload button. I'm going to reload it. And look at that. Is that not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? People have told me that in my past life, I probably was actually, Van Gogh himself. So I'm curious if you agree with that or not. But there you have it. We have our beautiful web page with these wonderful colors, and you can kind of imagine how this works behind the scenes, right? It's not really the most tricky thing once you kind of get your mind around, okay, like, I'm targeting these H1s, that's somehow doing its thing. And I have an H1 over here. It's right here. This one here in line 24, sorry. And it says, welcome, let's make it red, right? That's basically what's happening in plain English. Same with the P tag, make it pink in the background and give it some blue border, right? Make it pink in the background, give it some blue border. Make the background of the entire HTML document green, right? Make the background entirely green. Relatively intuitive. Now, I should say that to get really good at CSS is pretty much impossible. It takes a really, really long time to get really comfortable with all the fancy things that you can do, like centering and positioning and all that kind of stuff. And we're not going to go too deep into that through the DOM series. We're going to really focus on the DOM itself. There are plenty of tutorials online about HTML and CSS. If you would like me to create some, definitely let me know. But I'm going to really be focusing on some of the gaps I feel there are in some of these tutorials. So that is a basic kind of rundown of CSS for you. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's take a look at JavaScript next. Now, we're probably hopefully most familiar with JavaScript. We have a whole series on the channel about JavaScript, and we go pretty deep, pretty much everything we'd ever need to know about JavaScript for the most part to build anything. And the interesting thing is, if you think about this page, right? Like if we just look at this page, we have HTML. I just want to show you the beauty of this. I just want to keep bringing it us back to this moment of awesomeness. If we look at this page, we have HTML. And we have some CSS now, right? So we have some styling, we have the presentation, we have the semantics for it. But if I click things, or if I scroll or whatever happens to be, like nothing really happens. This is just showing us the structure. This is just showing us the styling, and there's no interactivity, right? For example, let's come back up to our VS Code, and below this welcome, I'm going to actually add a button. Okay, and in this button, I'm going to just say, click me. We're going to do this demo again in a second, but I just really want to show you what I mean, right? This is a button, right? It has some text in it, and it says, click me, right? I'm going to switch back to here. I'm going to reload the page. There's my button, okay? Now, very tempting to click this. Resist the urge. Okay, now you can click it. I'm going to click it, all right? Look at that. Look at that. Look at that feedback we get. It's beautiful feedback, but nothing is happening, right? There's no change on the page. We're not getting any feedback beyond kind of these colors changing that we're clicking this button. So how do we make this work? Well, if you really think about it, that's the purpose of JavaScript, right? JavaScript literally is meant, and it originally was built actually to take HTML and CSS and add some pizzazzle, some spice, some interactivity to it, okay? So without JavaScript, these web pages are just static web pages. They don't really have any interactivity or functionality beyond just displaying information and kind of prettying it up. Now, you can get kind of creative with CSS and HTML and like fake some interactivity, but really at the end of the day, to do anything meaningful, you need to add JavaScript to a web page in order to pretty much do anything. Now, this is why I highly recommend people to learn JavaScript before HTML and CSS, because eventually, once you build a couple of web pages like this, and you just look at awe of the beauty of it all, eventually you're kind of like, okay, that's great and everything, but how do I click the button? How does the button do the thing? And then you eventually have to reach out to JavaScript anyways, so we might as well learn that first, because that really gives it an understanding and a good base in order to actually jump back into HTML and CSS later. Okay, so I should mention though, before we can keep going with this, that with JavaScript, there's really two types of JavaScript, at least there's actually more than two, but two main types of JavaScript that we're going to be looking at as web developers to start, at least. There's client side and server side. When we were looking at Node.js and JavaScript in depth in that series, if you've taken a look at that and gone through that, we were doing it in Node.js, which is actually a backend or server side framework, or tool, I should say. Right now, when we're running JavaScript, which we'll do in a second, we're going to be running it on the client side. We are not going to be running it in the Node.js environment or the Dino environment or the Electron environment or whatever it happens to be. We're running it in the browser. So in Firefox, in Chrome, in all that kind of stuff, right? The engines that parse the JavaScript are the same, and I'll make a video on how all this works later on, but I just want to make that important distinction. There's a difference between running in the browser and running on the server. And we'll see some of those differences shortly. Okay, so to start, let's take a look at our button, right? This is our button. We just took a look at it. We have it in HTML, just HTML, right? We didn't add any JavaScript yet. We added a button, which is semantically here on our page. We can click on it, It has a little bit of feedback, kind of nice, right? Kind of pretty. There's some pretty things, right? It's even got a little hover. Look at that. It's pretty beautiful, but it doesn't do anything, right? Pretty boring button. It's pretty deceiving to click that thing. So how do we make it interactive? Well, we need to add JavaScript. So we're going to start super basic, and I don't want you to focus on the code for now. I just want you to focus on the fact that we're adding interactivity. We're going to get to this topic much later because it's actually quite nuanced and we can go quite deep with it. This is something called events and attributes and things like that, and we can go really, really far with this. But I just want to show you what I mean when I'm talking about interactivity, just so that it clicks kind of in your brain. Okay? No pun intended with that one. Okay, so let's go back to our VS Code here, and on my button, I'm going to add an on click here inside of the angle brackets, and I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to put a string, an empty string to start. I'm going to use double quotes for this, and then inside of here, I'm going to do an alert and brackets, and I'm going to use single quotes, and I'm just going to say, I don't know, I'll just say boo, right? Just like that. So on click equals and a string and then alert boo. Now you're probably looking at this and being like, well, what is happening here? Right, so first of all, let's just see this work, and then let's try to parse it out together to see what's happening. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to reload the page. Okay. And the reason we're reloading the page, just so that it makes sense, is so that we're refreshing the code, right? Because the browser is not going to be doing this for us automatically. I should mention before I go into this, there are tools that we can use that automatically do this for us. However, I really don't like using them, especially when we're starting, just so that we can really get into the habit of understanding what it is we're writing and minimize the amount of tools that we need so that we don't get confused and we can focus on the fundamentals. So that said, let's see what happens if we click this button after I've reloaded the page and saved the file. And there we go, right? It's a little bit small on my screen because I can't actually zoom in on this one, but it's going to say this page says boo in this case, right? And if I click OK, click it one more time, it comes up again, right? Look at that. Look at that. It's beautiful. Boo. Amazing. Okay, so great. That works pretty well. So what have we done? Well, let's take a look at the code. We have added to our HTML some JavaScript code. What's the code? Well, it's technically this right here. This is also technically adding some code behind the scenes as well, but really this is the code that we're adding. What is alert? Well, it's a function that comes in the browser that we can use to make that modal pop up. Now, this does not work in environments like Node.js, for example, as you can probably imagine, but we can also change this to something else. So if I change this alert to be a console.log of boo, which you might have seen before if you've done JavaScript, and then I come back here and I reload this page, well, if I click it now, nothing's going to happen. Seemingly nothing. Okay, I'm going to actually right click, inspect, and open up my DevTools here. And I'm going to go to the console tab, and I'm going to zoom in here a lot. And you can see that boo has been logged out here on my HTML on line 25. HTML.html, my beautiful file name, line 25. And if I click this button, look at that number go up. Look at it. Looks like a clicker game. It's great. We've made our basic clicker game, all right? So that's pretty good. So, and that's coming from line 25 right here, right? Which is exactly what we would expect where the on click is actually triggering. Now, again, we're gonna get into detail on this later because this is a whole bunch of topics kind of in one, but just so conceptually you know what I mean when I say interactivity, we're doing something. We're actually causing some logic. We can change what that thing is. At first we had an alert. Now we have a console log. We can literally do anything that we want. We can go fetch from an API. We can run a bunch of loops. We can freeze the browser. We can change stuff on the web page. We can do anything we want. Literally, JavaScript is the limit of what we can do. Okay, so let's keep it at that for now. So yeah, so that's basically how we can do it. Another way that we can do it is we can actually add a script tag at the top of our code. So let me show you that really quick. Instead of doing it this way, technically what you can do is you can add code up here in the head. Okay, so after our style, I'm going to add a script, and I'm going to close the script. And inside of here, I'm going to do for example, a console.log of hello there, my friend, right? Just like that. So script, close script tag, and then console log inside the script tag. Again, this is all in the head. And I'm going to go back to my web page here. I'm going to reload the page with my console open. And we'll see we get a hello there, my friend, right away as soon as we reload the page coming from HTML.html, line 20. And if we look at that, that is indeed right here, line 20, HTML.html. If I click my button, There we go. We get boo from line 28 now because it got shifted down, and that's coming from right here. So we can actually run JavaScript code this way. We can actually run it in this particular case this way as well. We'll see kind of pros and cons and kind of what these are actually doing behind the scenes a bit later. But just so you know, this is how we would add interactivity to our actual HTML files. Okay, we are taking things that are static and a little bit boring, and we're turning them into something that actually does something when we interact with them, hence the interactivity part. Okay, now next, I want to show you something that you probably haven't thought of too much before, and I feel like this is really something important to actually tie all these concepts together, and now we're getting into the DOM. So in the previous video, we looked at this drawing chart, right? I put together the idea of this window object, which we'll see in a second. We have the BOM, otherwise known as the web APIs. And we have the DOM, which is what we're studying in this series, and we have JavaScript itself over here. Now, the window object I claimed includes all of these things. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. Let's go back to our browser. And over here, maybe I can zoom in even a little bit more, just so it's a bit more clear, because I'm gonna really focus here on the console. We can do this in our JavaScript file as well, but just to have it be more interactive and quick, we're gonna do this in the console. Okay, we're going to switch between doing this in the console and the browser and the dev tools, as well as our code quite often. You should get comfortable doing it both ways. I actually run a lot of code in this console to practice different JavaScript concepts because it's so accessible. It's a very similar to typing node on your command line and using that REPL as they call it. Okay. Just that we have access to the browser functions in here as well, since this is running in the browser context. Now, to start, I want to show you this. I want to mention that in here, you technically don't need to do a console log because everything gets evaluated and logged out by default in this browser REPL. So if I do window and I press enter, you'll see that we get the window object. Okay. Now, I'm going to open this and I want to show you something interesting. If you're using a different browser like Firefox or I believe Safari, I'm not actually sure, I haven't checked recently, a lot of these are going to be hidden, okay? The reason for that is kind of beyond the scope of this course, and we didn't really cover it in JavaScript in depth because it's a bit advanced, but it has to do with something called property descriptors. So if you're using one of those browsers and you don't want to switch to Chrome, you can just do this. You can do object.getOwnProperty descriptors, plural, and you can do window in here. And you can press enter, and you can get kind of a little bit uglier, but a functional view of everything in there with some extra information. If you're interested in what the property descriptors are, basically anything marked as enumerable will not show by default in these console logs and in other things like keys and values and stuff like that. Not really relevant for this. Just wanted to show you just in case you'd be like, oh my gosh, Nader, this stuff is not popping up for me. Again, I highly recommend you use Chrome because it makes some of this stuff a lot easier in their dev tools. So that said, if you look at the window object, let's see what's in here. So here's alert, right? We actually have this in here. We just use this, right? That's pretty cool. But curiously, we didn't need to do window.alert, right? So let's go back to our code here. Right? If you remember, here we had an alert, right? And this, if I save this and I come back in here and I reload this page, this works. This brings up the alert. If I switch this to window.alert, let's see if it still works. If I come back here, reload the page, click it, it still works. Okay. The reason is that if I show you window, everything on this window, which is the default global object only in the browser. Again, I should repeat that one more time because it's so important. This is why we're going through this course. The window object is only available in the browser context. What does that mean? Node.js, Dino, all these other tools do not have a window, at least not by default. Okay, it's just going to be undefined. All right, and that means everything on there generally is going to be quite different than what we have in the browser. Which makes sense because stuff in there is not going to be relevant a lot of time for things like Node.js, which I'll show you in a second. Alert, for example, doesn't make sense in Node.js because we would not, like, what does that mean to alert something? Is that the same as a console log? Let's scroll through this really quick, look through some of these. There's a bunch of interesting ones in here. For example, we have document, which we're going to look at shortly. We have fetch. So this is the fetch API, right? So this is available by default in the browser these days. Pretty awesome. And let's look at that. We have IndexedDB, local storage. These are the web APIs, right? So if I come back to this over here, we're actually able to see some of the things on the window object that are from the web APIs. Again, not available as part of JavaScript by default, and also not part of the DOM, right? There's these three different objects. So technically, something like fetch right here is available to us, but it is part of the BOM or part of the web APIs. Okay, and there's many of these. There's dozens of them, right? Document, which we just looked at, is not part of the web APIs. It's part of the DOM. It's not part of JavaScript, and it's not part of the BOM. Let's look at the JavaScript parts. Let's scroll down here a second. So we have navigation. That's a web API. We have all these on some things. These are all events, which we'll look at later. I'm going to scroll past all these. Look at all that. It's so long. We have things like outer height and outer width and all that kind of stuff, right? Now, this has to do with literally the window that I'm opening right now, right? This is in pixels, how much height and how much width and all that kind of stuff. And we'll look at some of this in the geometry section of the DOM later. Of course, this doesn't make sense again in something like Node.js, because what does that mean, right? Does that mean the terminal's height and width? That's kind of random, right? That's pretty arbitrary. It only really makes sense in the browser context because we're trying to display HTML, for example, or CSS, and we're trying to use these boundaries to display our content. Okay. Let's keep looking here. We got like a prompt, we have resizing, we have a screen, scrolling. Again, probably doesn't make sense in something like Node.js. We have all this kind of React stuff. And now I want to show you something kind of interesting. Okay. If I scroll these, the color changes a little bit, but I want you to kind of take a look at this and really analyze it. Okay. For example, we have array. Now, my question to you is, which part of these three is array, right? It's kind of on the slide. It's part of JavaScript, right? It's not a web API. That doesn't really make sense. It's not the DOM, because that doesn't really make sense either. It has nothing to do really the structure and the flow of the page. It's literally part of JavaScript, right? Array is literally square brackets, right? Same with array buffers, even though we haven't seen that before. Some of these are part of the web APIs or part of the DOM. Let's scroll a bit further down. We have blob. That's technically, we have Boolean. That's part of JavaScript for sure. That's 100% JavaScript. We have some CSS stuff in here. That's kind of cool. Let's scroll past that. Clipboard. That's cool. Browser API. We have DOM, a bunch of DOM stuff in here. Great. We have date. That's part of JavaScript. Okay. The point of this is, I hope you're starting to see, right? Like, there is stuff in here that is mixed from these three concepts. I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but it's just so important. This is why it's important to study the DOM, because if you conflate or confuse what part of where these things are coming from, a lot of the coding that you do with JavaScript is going to get very complicated. For example, when you're coding on the front end, if you assume that you have access to things that are in Node.js, it's not going to work. Vice versa, if you're in Node.js and you assume you have access to like the window and the document, for example, or local storage, it's also not going to work, right? You're going to get errors like cannot read like, property query selector of undefined or something because there's no document, or cannot read property document or something, right? Because those don't exist in those environments. So you always have to think about the context that you're running your code inside and whether what you're asking the computer to do actually makes sense. This becomes incredibly complicated when you start looking at technologies, for example, like Electron, which is actually how VS Code is built, and things like Slack, for example, where they actually use JavaScript to build those tools for the desktop, but they also work in the browser. So the question is, well, do those have access to window? Do they have access to JavaScript, DOM? And the question is, it kind of depends, right? There's all sorts of things you can do with these tools, but it depends on the context that you're running that code in. So always have that at the back of your mind. So if you see these errors, you can kind of fall back to that and realize that this is not just like voodoo magic that's popping up because it's just yelling at you for no reason, right? There's a reason why we get these errors, right? And the reason is that the context that we run JavaScript in matters. A lot of the other languages don't have this problem because they don't run on the front end and they don't run on so many different environments. For example, Java only runs on specific subsets of like environments. You have to have the Java virtual machine. You have to have it set up in a particular way. It doesn't run in the browser. I can't write Java code I'm kind of lying a little bit because these days we kind of can, but generally speaking, I can't just run JavaScript by itself and run it in the browser, right? I can't just write a bunch of classes in Java and then import it into the browser like I would JavaScript and then just run it. There's some new tools like WebAssembly that allow you to do that, but those are way beyond the scope of this part of the series for now. Okay, so yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I highly encourage you to literally go through this list. I know that sounds like I'm asking you to watch paint dry, right? But I promise you that if you go through this list a couple of times, the more that you see these different things pop up, the easier it will be. For example, all these HTML elements, we're going to go deep into these because these are all part of the DOM. These are not part of JavaScript, and they're also not part of the web APIs. Okay, so if you see something in here that feels interesting or you've always wondered about it, look it up on MDN and see, is it in the BOM or the web APIs? Is it in the DOM? Is it part of JavaScript? Okay, very, very important concept. Perfect. So that's enough about that. I want to show you this next. So to kind of wrap this up, I want to kind of go through this idea of the document. So if you think about document is part of the DOM, which is what we're studying in this series together. There are other things that are part of the DOM, like nodes and events, which we'll look at in future videos. But if we think about document, which is really the easiest one to get started with, let's see what we get. So if we look at our HTML code, let's say that we have this code or even the code that we just wrote together. When we say document, we're actually referring to window.document. So let me show you what I mean. If I go back to my browser, I'm going to clear this. I'm going to say document, and I get this document thing. You notice when I highlight it, it highlights everything in blue. If I open up this document, and you can see that I can highlight over these different sections and open them up. And if I highlight through the body in here, you can see that the different things actually highlight. So it's telling me that it kind of notices what I'm trying to ask it live as I'm hovering over these, which is very useful for debugging. Okay. Now the head is not going to do that because the head is kind of like up here and hidden for the most part. But for everything in the body, at least the elements that are visible on the screen, it will actually highlight them for us, which is kind of nice. Now this is slightly of an annoying visual here. So I'm actually going to show you a trick that we can do. I'm going to do a console.dir, which is a directory listing of the document. And if we run that, we should get this object. Let me open that again. And this is going to show us all of the properties of this object. This is an object. Okay. Document is the same as window.document. And I'll prove that to you in a second. The reason we can just say document is because the global object in the browser context is the window. So because of scoping, the way that it's going to look is going to look up the scope chain, and it's going to eventually find document as a global property at the root level or at the window level, which is the global object. So since that is on the global object, if we look through document, what we'll see is a whole bunch of interesting things. You can see that in here, we have the URL, for example, which is what I have over here. We have anchors, applets, whatever those are. We have body. Look at that. So if I open up body, well, if I highlight over it, you can see that it's highlighting the body. So every time you do document.body, for example, if you've seen that before, you're literally accessing window.document.body. And that's giving you access through JavaScript to this HTML. Okay? Super important to eventually wrap your mind around that. We have child knows children. We'll look at this later on. There's all sorts of fun stuff in here. Look at that. We have our doc type in here as well. That's our doc type at the very start that we wrote with the HTML. We have the whole HTML element in here. We have a whole bunch of fun stuff like fonts. We have the head, which is not shown, but in here is going to have kind of all the properties related to the head and the styles and stuff like that. We have links. We have all our events. I'm going to scroll past those really quick. Don't want to spend too much time on that. We have, look at this. We got our scripts, right? All the scripts that are on the page. And if I open this up, we can actually eventually, if I open this up, we can see, like, look at this script is coming from our file on my file system. And this is the name of the file. And if I was to kind of scroll all the way, we'd actually be able to see it. It's just too zoomed in. And you can actually see that in this case, since it's an actually inline script, we can actually see the text inside of our script. And this is because we're accessing this all through the document object, which is part of the DOM, which is our interface to the HTML and CSS from JavaScript. So JavaScript is literally giving us this object to talk to the actual HTML and CSS on the page. So not only can we read it, we can change it, update it, delete it. We can do all that kind of stuff live on the actual web page through the DOM API. And this is why it also works in other languages, as long as they have their own version of document, for example, or own version of elements or window or whatever it happens to be. As long as they implement them in the same way and follow the same interface, they can also access all of this data inside of HTML and inside of CSS because they're all standardized already. They all have a format that is not going to change to maintain backwards compatibility. So if you were to build a library, for example, for say Python, you could be guaranteed that if you scope it towards the DOM and make sure you follow all the rules of the DOM, that you can actually give someone an HTML file in Python and actually read out all of the different things like the head and the body and the scripts and all that kind of stuff, which is totally amazing. That's the purpose of the DOM, to actually interface with the HTML and CSS on a web page from any language. In this case, from JavaScript, because we're running it from the developer tools, which runs in JavaScript. Okay, I want to show you something interesting here. If I say window is equal to document is equal to window.document, you can see that these are the same object. Okay, when we say document, we're actually referring to window.document because of how the scoping works. Check this out. We have window.math, right? Whenever we do math.random, we're really at least in the browser, we're doing window.math.random. And this is equal to math.random. All right, look at that. That's pretty amazing. We literally have access to all the things in JavaScript through this window object. In this case, this is part of the DOM. This is part of JavaScript, right? For example, another one that's going to kind of blow your mind a little bit, window.object is equal to the object. Right? Whenever we do new object, which is just a like what happens behind the scenes whenever we do this, that's a new object, right? This is referring to the object constructor, which is on the window in this case. That's part of JavaScript. But if I say, for example, window.fetch, right? This is equal to fetch, which is a web API. Okay, so here this is a web API. This is JavaScript. This is JavaScript. Document is part of the DOM. Okay, this window object literally has everything on it that we need in order to access any of these three kind of schools of working with the browser through JavaScript. Okay, hopefully I've hammered that home enough. That pretty much wraps up this video. There's not going to be any exercises for this section because I don't think it's really worth too much time to spend like a lot of time on these different topics here, because we're going to go into depth into all these. This is mainly just an introduction. We're going to start exercises with the next topic, which is going to be this guy right here, the node and different node types. I'm super excited to get to that topic because that's where we can actually start finally working with the DOM, understanding the different components of it in depth, and actually start manipulating it, reading it, and eventually writing back to it in future videos. But really understanding some of the nitty-bitty details, itty-bitty nitty-gritty details that you kind of ignore when you're working in a very, very high level context, for example, something like React. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next video where we're actually going to look together at the node interface and the node type with all the things that come with it in the DOM together. See you later.